Okay, so welcome back, everyone, to the live intersectoral panel, where we open a forward-looking conversation on the role of collections and collections-based organizations in advancing sustainable development, with a particular focus on the planet dimension. That is to promote biodiversity, conservation, restoration, climate action, and sustainable production and consumption as vital contributors to a healthier, more resilient future for everyone and for our planet. So I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for this conversation. So we have Sara Ahmed. Hello, Sara. Sara is the founder and director of the Living Waters Museum in India and the vice president of the Global Network of Water Museums, bringing the perspectives of national and international museum networks dedicated to water heritage and its role in environmental action. Next panelist is Sara Stannage. Hi, Sara. I have two Saras today. The executive director of the International Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, IIC, which is also one of the core organizers of this conference and the key organization in the global heritage conservation community. Sara brings to the table her experience and insights on how to integrate and foster environmental sustainability in heritage conservation practice. Then we have Matthew Pai. Hi, Matthew. Welcome to the panel. Matthew is the head of philosophy at the European School Brussels II and founder of the Climate Academy that aims to promote climate education for system change. And Matthew brings to the discussion his perspectives both as a philosopher and a climate educator. And last but not least, we have Stacey Alvarez de la Campa. Hi, Stacey. Co-founder and vice president of the Climate Rights and Justice International, bringing her insights and expertise in as a legal and educational consultant and environmental activist with a background in law, education, and climate justice. So you can find our panelists' full biographies on the conference website. And to moderate this panel, I'm delighted and pleased to welcome back Henry McGee from Curating Tomorrow. Hi, Henry. Henry has a background in animal ecology and a deep commitment to the natural world, human rights, and the transformative power of museums. And Henry also brings to the conversation a compelling vision for how cultural institutions can drive inclusive and sustainable development. So, Henry, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Jose, and welcome everyone, and welcome to the panelists. And so I'll just say a few words just for introduction, just to kind of set out the context. So the planet dimension of sustainable development is often a bit, let's say, misunderstood. It doesn't just mean that nature is a kind of stage or a platform that people live their lives on, nor does it just mean that nature is a kind of a mine of natural resources that we use and we just try to use them a bit more carefully. That's not right at all. So for more than 50 years, since the earliest days of sustainable development, there's been a strong recognition that the way, particularly Western societies, are running things is just not working. We have to acknowledge that people and nature are not separate things. They're not separate entities. That we do not have two separate planets on which we live. We are part of nature, and the more we can recognize this as being a kind of basis for sustainable development, the further we might get. And also, as we talked a lot yesterday at the people section, that we also have to remember that sustainable development is ultimately a justice program. We're not talking just about resources. We're talking about people, and we're talking about responsibility, and we're talking about the past, the present, and the future. So lots of fantastic things to bring together. And so I've got three questions that we'll ask to each of our panelists and then we hopefully we will get through everything. And so the first one I'll direct to Sara from the Living Waters Museum to ask, how do you see heritage collections and collections-based organisations currently contributing to the planet dimension of sustainable development?
Hi, thanks for the question, Henry. So I run a hybrid museum that works on water heritage, the built heritage, natural and cultural heritage around water. And our collection is our online repository, our online archive, which we've built over the last 8 years with youth and children across India, looking at water from a multidimensional and inclusive lens. But a collection or a museum cannot just be a website. So for us, the connections between our online work and the conversations that we facilitate, what I would call creative placemaking, that's very, very important. So these conversations include walks along waterfronts. They include meetings around films or working with children with special needs, engaging them to think about water. The conversations also involve school children collecting plastic from waterfronts, working around mangroves in the Sundarbans, planting species that communities want as well. So there are a lot of ways that collections can move from physical or virtual museums to engage with communities, to engage with schools, to engage with children, and particularly, I would say, to engage with marginalized communities around issues of water and water justice.
Thanks, Sara. And we'll move next to Sara with the same question.
Thanks, Henry, and thank you for having me here. I mean, I'm very fortunate to work with IIC, an organisation that supports thousands of conservators around the world, and I can say with some confidence that conservators do inherently care about sustainability on our planet, and that's, I think, demonstrated by a lot of work and research that's going on at the moment. Because I think fundamentally, when we're looking at caring for collections, it's more than just preserving collections for the future generations. It's looking at preserving cultural identity, preserving knowledge, preserving practices. And I think critically, that's about preserving humanity and our planet. But it goes beyond that. It's more around the inspiration of those collections for future sustainability initiatives. So looking at how we can use those collections as sources of inspiration. They're just incredibly useful in terms of looking at discovery in practice, things like that. And I think they're underutilized and valued in that space. And I think that's something we need to do better on in advocating. I also think, within collecting-based institutions, whether that's museums or libraries or archives, there's an opportunity as well to lead by example, whether that's reducing in terms of carbon footprints through to education programs, just as Sara's been saying as well. It's just incredibly interactive in terms of what the opportunities can do with collections. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of really good initiatives. I'm hoping to share a few more in this example, but I'll hopefully share that in a while in terms of what we're hoping to achieve as well, working with conservators quite closely around the world.
Yeah, thank you, Sara. We'll move next to Matthew with the same question. Hi, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks. I think fundamentally sustainability, climate, resource extractions, and all of that is interdisciplinary. It cuts across every sector, it cuts across everything. And so if I speak as a teacher first, I'm here in school today. We have schools which are functioning in silos. We have chemistry, physics, maths, and so on. We have a whole society in a way which starts from the beginning in a siloed way. So I think what museums offer is this incredible opportunity to think in this 360-degree scope about everything. And secondly, schools are one of those precious places left on the planet where we're only interested in the truth here. We're only interested in reality. We don't have another agenda. As teachers, that's our currency. That's what we deal with. And let's say out there in the commercial world or in the political world, which is driven by, let's say monetary forces in general. Schools and museums share that sacred space like that. And if I kind of double down on those two aspects of it, all these climate and resource issues, if you take students out of their normal, this kind of liminal experience that you get in a museum or in any kind of space like that, you feel this extra capacity to think and reflect, and outside of those normal paradigms. So I think in that very general space, there's something very precious, this kind of liminalness. And of course, just very specifically to finish, if you zoom down on the actual objects that you get to interact with or engage with or to contemplate and so on, there is a power in those objects that they're in a museum or they're in a collection for a reason. They're there because they're powerful cultural objects which manage to capture some universal truths, and that's really if you mobilize those objects, you can really communicate some very powerful things about the human condition and our human situation, which in a way would just be almost impossible with a paper and a pen or something like that.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. And lastly, we come to Stacey with the same question. Hi, Stacey.
Hi there, everyone. Hi, great to be here. I think kind of leading on from what Matthew was saying about, the idea of cultural heritage, I think, heritage collections, they do provide this amazing foundational sense of a collective identity that I think it's really, really important for us to build on. So there's this, insight into the past and the connection of that past to the present and the future. And you feel part of a time continuum that's kind of larger than yourself. So the idea of students feeling that and knowing that they're doing something that connects them to something bigger than themselves, I think you can feel that at a real emotional level. And that, I think, is a kind of an awakening. So this kind of holistic overview provides a way to get to know the planet, to get to know the people and the planet. And then I think that's kind of like a spark to, it's an inspirational spark, and it makes you want to learn as much as possible. And I think if we can tap into learners, the intergenerational way that you can learn through a deeper, intimate knowledge of heritage collections, I think that in turn builds a sense of hope and empowerment. And then from a climate point of view, you want to protect the planet, the people, all the intersections in between, and just kind of take it from there and build a sense of resilience. So I think it's, heritage collections play a really important role in that regard. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And just to kind of lead us into the second question, I think I would make a few comments that whether the heritage organizations, whether they contribute, positively or not, to me it's often painted as a bit of a simple question. It's not like a paint color or something like, are they sustainable or are they not? They're really different. So they contribute positively. To me, they contribute both positively and negatively to the planet dimension. They can educate people, they can preserve cultural heritage for current and future generations. Also, they can educate people to look after nature. Unfortunately, they could also educate people not to look after nature. And also, they often have a very heavy carbon footprint. So if we think of sustainable development as about how we do more of the good stuff and less of the harmful stuff, I think that takes us into the next question about how can we further strengthen the role and recognition of collections and collection-based organizations for the planet dimension of sustainable development. What kinds of innovative and intersectoral partnerships can you imagine, can you see? And what would it take concretely to make this happen? And I'll start with Sara, please.
Right. So we're part of a global network of water museums that stretches from China to Mexico, Ecuador, countries in Africa and South Asia, and of course, France, Italy, Germany, etc., the Western world. And this global network was recognized by UNESCO's Intergovernmental Hydrology Program in 2018 as a special initiative to on SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation, etc. And I think that really, for me, seeing the way the network has grown from 30 museums in 2017 to more than 120 now, is really a sign of how we're building collaboration and partnerships, how museums are repositories of ancient water hydro technologies, for example, but they're also talking about hydro technologies in the context of adaptation to climate change. How are we working with small museums in fragile economies? In Burkina Faso, for example, we're working with a museum there. How are we working with museums in countries like Iraq or Iran, bringing them into this global discourse and building partnerships around water? Having said that, we do struggle a lot with resources. We're a fee-based organization, and it's often very hard for museums from less developed countries like Bangladesh and even India to contribute to this. But a lot of people were talking about education earlier, and I want to say that really is one of our big issues right now. How do we build, and we're trying to build a repository on open access resources on water and education and water classrooms and some really creative, interactive pedagogies that museums are using around water. And I think that's something we're doing over the next few years. So yes, that's an example of collaboration and partnership and building something new and strong.
Yeah, thank you, Sara. And we ask Sara the same question, please.
Thanks, Henry. This is the exciting space for me. It's such an opportunity area, genuinely. And I think in the last year or so, we've seen, so much goodwill around, particularly within sort of the conservation field, for moving forward some of these really overwhelming, quite complicated agendas around climate and around environmental responsibility, and really advancing practice into really exciting spaces around research and development. And we created a program just over a year ago. It's just concluded around innovation with many conservators around the world. So 30 conservators called Innovate Scholars. And part of that space was about thinking through ideas that could really work in the practice. So Henry, as you were saying, sort of can be quite carbon intensive in terms of collection care, so how we can sort of work on those sorts of agendas and actually move positively. And it went even further than just those sort of typical areas of environmental responsibility into looking at, and probably not just one P, but all of the Ps, looking at, how museums in particular, but also different sort of collecting institutions and those involved in those spaces can really work within communities and in their environments to positively promote change. And there's some really good examples, and I'll certainly share the link to our Innovate Scholars work. We provided some seed funding, and I think that was critical to be able to catalyse some of this, to be able to go beyond words and actually into action. There was really good, 3 really good innovation projects that have come forward, and they're sort of moving now into that sort of delivery phase, which is great. One in particular that I'll mention here, by Rodolange in Kenya with Karen Blixen Museum, which really focused on zero waste policies, and also looking at where the museum was situated, looking at the environment of the museum for tree planting, for example, but also engaging with the young people in the community where there was high unemployment rates, and looking through the zero waste strategy, and collection care was part of that, to reuse some of the materials to make items for selling, for example, at local markets. So it was really sort of coming together in terms of what the community could do with the collections and with that museum. And I think that's a really good celebration about what can be achieved if given a bit of space, a bit of time, and a little bit of funding to do that. And I think that's what we can really look to promote, I think, moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Sara. And Matthew, same question, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think if I speak again about where I come from in terms of a school, in terms of climate education, that's my speciality. I think it's probably mirrored in these collections and museums and wider things, as it is mirrored in the media and broader society. And the central point I want to insist on is that in schools, we do a fantastic job in primary school, sensitizing children to the environment and kind of, let's say, tactile, individual action-based things. We do a great job with that. But then you get to teenage and it kind of stops. We don't push them into the complexity of the problem. We don't confront them with planetary boundaries and the proximity of those boundaries and the dangers of those boundaries. We kind of back off because it's a little bit scary or it's a bit, big. And so therefore what happens is the whole of our education, and perhaps in museums this is reflected as well, so I'm just saying how we can advance things, is that you get this drop-off in attention from teenagers. Like, they just feel disempowered because what does my little action on recycling do in the big? And so they just unplug. So there's a hump to get over in education, which my Climate Academy is set up to do, is to engage them in complexity, confront them with these boundaries. And what happens then is you then get this kind of acceleration of their interest because suddenly they're awake because this is now actually a problem. This is urgent and it demands all these different kind of skills to overcome it. And those skills are creative, so when we talk about innovation, I think we have to make sure that we're framing it really acutely within the sharp parameters of the planetary bounds, which are, just a few years away for 1.5 is cooked, 2 degrees is very close. Now, in a way, schools would back off from that because they don't want to alarm students, they don't provoke anxiety, but actually those feelings are, in a way, the baseline for the really deeply creative stuff, and it's like a new territory for them. And so just like you have amazing works of art, they were always asking the transformative question. They were always pulling into question the status quo. That's what great art could do. It was transcendent like that. So museums have this capacity, and these collections have this capacity to provoke those questions, because the pioneers, let's say in the Renaissance or in whatever, they were always pioneers of breaking new ground. And I think that's the space that we're in. So if our climate change education or if our kind of exhibitions are too safe, then that's a disaster, because the situation that we're in is properly a crisis, and that needs to be reflected in the way in which we present things, and that gives a real sharpness then and a real energy and a drive which empowers engagement and drives engagement, and it opens up all kinds of fresh creativity within the people engaging with the artifacts and so on. So that's kind of my central gravity of what I think in terms of education, where it needs to go. And I suspect it's true more widely.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And I'll turn now to Stacey, and I'll also ask if you can think of, are there particular roles that libraries could play? Because we've talked much about museums, and please.
Yeah, sure. I definitely really agree, and I love the sentiments of our other panelists because I see how it's all kind of working together. And then again, kind of jumping off what Matthew was saying, it's actually that the way that we're turning away from really acknowledging the complexity that is breeding a lot of the anxiety, I think, in the teenage generation, because there's a powerful level at which you feel something's going on. You hear the snippets of it, but because it's not being properly addressed, that's where the anxiety comes, and that's when you switch off. So I think that's why definitely the role of heritage education, and by extension libraries, because books to me are just these living, amazing treasure troves of wonder that you can tell I'm a bit of a nerd and I like actual books as opposed to like Kindles or screens. But when you introduce children and teenagers again, because a lot of teenagers haven't actually read that many actual physical books, to the tactile physical sensation of turning the page. And I mean, I'll go down to the nerd wormhole again, like the smell of a new book. Like, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And then linking that sense of wonder to the idea that, this planet dimension and strengthening, collections-based organizations and libraries to moving away from the silos that we referred to earlier and saying, everything really is interconnected. And when you look at that intersectionality, that's kind of when the creativity starts to come out. And that's where we can see that we can appreciate the complexities. We can appreciate sometimes being scared or intimidated is a good thing, because you start to collaborate and you begin, and that's again where the hope builds. So I think this intersectional approach to everything, the approach to embracing the creativity that comes from being pushed out of a comfort zone is the role that libraries and heritage collections can play. And then as well, the whole idea that, you know, I think an innovative way or a partnership that you can look at the marginalized communities, look at Indigenous communities who, I mean, we have to acknowledge that there's a level of extractivism that we associate with heritage collections. I mean, and being Indigenous myself from the Caribbean, I know that that is something where you'll go to a museum that will have an artifact from me and my people and say that I'm extinct. And I know I'm here, I know I'm living and breathing. So it's an acknowledgement of that history is linked to the present. It's formed the foundation of who we are. And when we get that living tapestry to come through, I think we can definitely play a role in removing that othering that can happen to make it seem as if we're all separate and no, well, you know, we're all in this together, and, you know, having consultations with more marginalized communities to co-create what's happening in collections and in libraries, I think would be a good thing. I could go on, but I will stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Stacey. That's a great contribution. And I suppose my last question is to all four of you. Is if you had a magic wand that you could wave to do one thing to unlock the potential of collections and collections-based institutions for the planet dimension, what would that one thing be?
Going to start with me
Sara,
again.
please.
So I want to respond a little bit to what Stacey and Matthew were saying as well, because Stacey, a lot of the work that we're doing is around decolonizing museums. And that's, I mean, when you build something which is online or physical or whatever, when you're co-creating content with local communities, not being extractive, you know, these are really the kind of ways that we're working in. And that doesn't apply to all the water museums. I think that just applies to some of us trying to do this differently. But for me, and this I think goes back to something Matthew was saying as well, how over the last few years we've been looking at how we connect our exhibitions to water classrooms which are inclusive, interactive, and fun, and that bring up difficult issues, discrimination, gender access, and all of that. And of course, a lot more things. But from education, action, how do you have that one thing that a student can take home and he or she can actually adopt? And then how do you measure impact? And I think that is a question that I'm always struggling with. How do I measure impact from that? So if I could do whatever I wanted to do and resources were not an issue, I would really, really look at pedagogy as the fundamentals of how we influence and work with young minds, and how we help them think about water, not just from a biophysical or a chemical world, but water, which is a shared resource. It's a humanitarian resource. It's so many things. It links to your body, to public health issues, to the pandemic, to the conflict that's unfolding in the Middle East. You know, there's so many ways of looking at water and linking it all up together, and having children think about that from an entry point which is not threatening to them. I think that's, for me, the change. And then how do you translate that into action and impact?
Okay, thanks, Sara. That's a fantastic contribution there. Thank you. And Sara, please.
Thanks, Henry. I'm going to focus on funding and funders, because I think that's an area that if I had a magic wand, I'd love to work with more funders that are enlightened around, you know, investments as well into collecting institutions and collections more generally, and people that work with them. And I think that could be quite exciting if more funders were doing sort of catalyst type of funding or seed funding kind of initiatives, so that we can look at innovation and look at sort of how it's possible to empower people, because I think that's what we're going to need sort of moving forward to try and accelerate into the space with solutions that we need for the climate agenda and how we work together. And I think funders are a very important part of that sort of collaboration space. And I'm also really fascinated by climate finance, for example, how that could come in to support heritage, which I think hasn't been looked at in detail. So there's lots of areas I'd love to, if I had a magic wand, to explore further. But I do think funding, I think that could be, because it's such a barrier often, I think, for lots of collecting institutions, and certainly for conservators trying to work in this space. So I think that's, if I had a magic wand, unlimited funding, but it's not possible. But I think working together to try and unlock some of that would be fantastic.
I think if I'm going to jump in and I'm going to put in my 2 pence worth, is that what I think is, if I had a magic wand, what I would want people to do is to live in the climate just future and to imagine that and to change their practices to fit that, rather than the other way around. Because if we just go for kind of incrementalism, we'll never get there. And so that's my one, really, is that people had much more radical imagination about what was possible and a much more radical commitment to get there. And so that's me taking over a bit. So Matthew, please. I couldn't help
in
myself.
fact, you sort of preempted what I was going to say, because you, in the idea of the magic wand, I'm flipping into teacher mode now. Like in Plato, you have the ring of Gyges, this idea that if you could be invisible, what would you do? And philosophy is often, let's say, caricatured as this dreamer thing or this abstract. But actually, the ideals, like you say, if you could actually be radical and actually experience ideals like that, it would have a transformative effect. I mean, in a way, the ideal is the most real thing. You know, we're not talking here about impractical things. This is the most practical thing on earth, is to live sustainably. So I think in that sense, playing with ideas and ideals is absolutely critical. And to be a little bit more specific, and again, to be philosophical, there's a sociologist-philosopher, Hartmut Rosa, and he made a distinction between acceleration and resonance. So his work basically says we live in a society which is always about acceleration. You could characterize it as profit or something like that. But in a capitalist system, everything is about accelerating experiences. But actually what we want as humans is resonance. We want to feel identity, security, meaning, purpose, those things. And I think if you could experience that in a museum, if we could have policymakers or even just middle managers in schools who are brave enough to not have a productive day where they're doing, learning X, Y, Z for the syllabus or the exam or whatever, to dare to believe that a moment of resonance can be just as powerful as something which is just instead accelerated. And I think museums and libraries and, this way we have those moments of resonance. So if we could, for me, then the magic wand is being brave enough to believe that resonance can be powerful and not just this kind of hyperactive acceleration of everything.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And we come lastly to Stacey.
Yeah, sure. I got so excited when I heard about the magic wand. I thought, oh my goodness, because it challenges you to really think and dream bigger, and you realize just how often you're set in that limited mindset. And I thought, with a magic wand, I think really every idea a lot of the ideas and the objects that we see as normal today, we're seen as radically ridiculous. I mean, things like the phone, the cell phone, the TV, a car, a plane, we're seen as what's crazy. And those are things that are now everyday realities, right? So we must never be afraid to. And I think if I had a magic wand, I would definitely try to take every single child, every single teenager, every learner, and do a kind of what I call a landscape exchange. So they could go to a different landscape and have, as Matthew says, a very non-productive day. It's a day you are immersing yourself into that landscape and really learning about it through feel, through interaction, whether it's through surfing at the beach, whether it's hiking in a forest, and really reconnecting to the planet and seeing that, again, you can't separate person from planet. I think we have to challenge that You know, there's a conservation paradigm that's built on the idea of nature being this untouched landscape. But we have to remember that Indigenous people and our ancestors lived together with nature, were then removed. If we think of Native Americans and the Trail of Tears, were systematically removed from that landscape. And that was presented as, well, this is a national park and this is nature. But it's actually much more natural for us to live sustainably and be in touch with our landscape. So I think every child, if every person could get the sense of wonder as a child and be immersed in a landscape that is unfamiliar, come to know it and spend time in it and love it. And then that, I think, would work wonders. And I think we really have to see it's possible, it's doable. Let's begin to think of it as possible, and then it can definitely happen. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And just a kind of closing remark is something I've, based on what Stacey was saying there. There's a great quote about how to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair inevitable. And so I think, I mean, I had a really very enjoyable panel discussion just now. I hope you've found it interesting to take part in and to listen to. And but I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you to all our panelists. Thank you.
Yes, so if I can jump in. So big thanks also to our moderator and of course to our panelists for your invaluable, powerful and inspiring insights. I think this conversation has been like a powerful reminder of the potential and the role of heritage collections and collections-based organizations to contribute to inclusive and sustainable development, especially when we work together with intention and creativity. So big thanks to you. We look forward to continue this dialogue beyond today.